Hello. I would also like to thank the Ordine, Assistenti, Sociali, and especially Silvana Vadelia for the opportunity to take part in this intriguing research and for the opportunity to speak to you here today. I would go on by this presentation by just talking about one of the issues or perspectives that we are pursuing within our project, and just to give you an example of what this could mean in practice. The issue I'm talking about is, of course, looking at attitudes and perceptions of social workers in a subnational perspective. This is something that has been quite neglected in social research at large. We think there has not been very much focus, main focus in previous research on, for instance, on attitudes, on how these attitudes vary in different subnational contexts like regions or municipalities and so on. We have, some of us, been conducting some research on this issue on other data from other countries before, and with the assumption that because we know that there are some local differences in service provision, for instance, and in political, the strength of political parties and coalitions and so on, and all these might also affect the climate in the area, in the municipality or region or so on, in welfare issues, because as in Italy also, for instance, in the Nordic countries, there are the services are mainly provided by local authorities. And we have gathered some data on these issues and found that among the general public on various sorry, I have forgotten to change the slide. On various attitudinal issues, we have found that among the population at large, generally people really seem to be affected by these kinds of local factors, like the political strength of different political coalitions, for instance, and also like structural factors, like, for instance, the how many unemployed there are, and so on. And later on, we have tried to do this also regarding Nordic social workers, using the Nordic part of the data that we are talking about here today. But among these people, we did not find any systematic local attitudinal variations. And it seems, of course, it can be partly related to what kind of attitudes you are asking about also, but it seems that the regional and municipal differences in the Nordic countries are, in international comparison at least, fairly small anyway. And this might be one of the things that explain why we have not found any such differences among social workers in the Nordic countries. But this, of course, was an intriguing starting point when we tried to, when we got the Italian data also, because, as you know much better than I do, the regional differences are usually thought of as being fairly big in Italy, at least compared to the Nordic countries, for instance. So we, of course, got interested in the question whether there are or might be greater differences between social workers here also than what we had found in the Nordic countries. I won't go more into the details about what kind of differences there are in Italy, because obviously you know much more about that issue at least than I do. I'm just going to, in a moment, show you some data on one of the questions that we have been looking at. Of course, you could do this for all the questions in the questionnaire, anything that you consider interesting. But at the same time, by showing this question, we thought of highlighting another issue that has been often used in international research on attitudes towards welfare issues. And also perhaps as one of the points we would like to later on hopefully hear some comments from you all regarding how you perceive these questions as questions, because they have been developed in an Anglo-Saxon societal context. It fits well also into the, I'll come back to why in a moment, it fits well also into the Nordic context, but the question of course is, does it feel like a natural kind of division in a country like Italy at all? So that we can discuss later on perhaps. These questions that you can see, or then you don't, no? Yes, here they are. Under A and B, it's not the exact question, of course, but the questions try to, you see the questions later on also, but they focus on the one hand on structural conditions as an explanation for poverty. That is, there is the kind of social policy that is conducted is not redistributive enough, and other societal measures are not taken to a satisfactory extent. If you think that, I mean, yes, well, if you blame structural conditions, these are the kind of issues that you blame. On the other hand, there is, and this is something that is considered also, happens to be considered as the main kind of view in the Scandinavian or social democratic kind of welfare state. Well, this has been at least traditionally seen as the main reason why social policies have been conducted as they have been, and why also, as others have talked about here before, there have been comparatively great resources, societal resources invested in trying to alleviate poverty. The other extreme, if you like, on a kind of continuum regarding views on why there is poverty in the world is the one that blames the individual himself or herself entirely, where lack of thrift and laziness and other kinds of morally less wishable characteristics are thought to be the main reason for why people are live in poverty. And if you have this view, of course, then there is not very much point in trying perhaps to alleviate poverty either. You might regard it as something that is everybody's own concern and not a concern of society at large, at least to the same extent. At least in the Anglo-Saxon world, this has been thought of as one of the dominating ideas behind the very restrictive social policies in the United States of America, for instance. All right, enough about that. Why look at this question regarding, for instance, social workers? We have done it because we know from other research already that the opinion on the question I just talked about strongly correlates with people's attitudes towards more concrete questions like how people should be helped and what kind of policy measures in more concrete circumstances that should be applied. And therefore this is generally thought of as a good proxy for measuring the general kind of social policy attitude that people possess. And of course, since, as already has been mentioned here before, also many social workers in many instances in Italy as in other countries have fairly big discretion when deciding in individual matters regarding individual clients. This, of course, is very likely to affect what kind of services people are getting, in fact. And therefore, of course, it's interesting also to know whether there are small or big differences between social workers on an issue. Are all social workers of the same opinion, or are there very big differences on these issues? Because then it will be dependent on whom you meet, what individual you meet, if you get more generous treatment, for instance, or if the attitude is more restrictive. Okay. Before we look at the figures, one more thing. Why should social workers come to be of either of these opinions at all? As usually, science or scientists have provided opposite explanations that do not fit together. On the one hand, you could think that an institutional context where, for instance, the whole policy organization is built around, well, one of these ideas, the social workers should also easily become socialized to the way of thinking, at least affected to some degree by what the organization thinks and society thinks. But on the other hand, you could also think that they are rather, social workers are rather in these kinds of issues, when poverty is concerned, are rather affected by situational factors. The fact that if there are many people that are poor, if a great amount of, or a big amount of people are poor in some area or in some country, it's rather unlikely that it should also be poured down to individual explanations, for instance. It does not seem very likely that all people are lazy or big. So there are different theoretical assumptions concerning what explains poverty. We have been looking at these two. I'm afraid we can't go very into detail about that, but I'll show you the figures. Some of you at least have them in front of you also. This slide is divided into two parts. As you can see, there are some questions measuring the structural poverty, or questions measuring structural point of view, and some other questions measuring an individual stance. And then on the right-hand side, you can see how many we have divided Italy at this point at least into only 3 regions. This division has been used before, as we understand it, in some instances. I won't say very much more about that in itself. Especially the first question on each, on the structural part and on the individual part, are questions that have been used internationally in very many instances. So we know what people have been answering in other parts too. And it's not always this clear, but among social workers we can say also in other Italian social workers as a rule do not seem to be very different from Nordic social workers, for instance, here. Most are in, at least on this first question that I mentioned, are very much more in favor of structural explanations than individual type of explanations. But as you can see, even there seem to be even a greater deal in the southern parts of Italy that support at least these, if we look at the first question on each, on the first question on the whole slide. There you can see that there are even more people who support this idea of structural injustices as a basis for poverty in the southern parts of Italy. This is something that we perhaps can discuss afterwards, how we should see this fact. But I think and what explanations could be behind it. I named some before. If you have any opinions on that, we would be grateful to hear it. But now I think I've talked a lot and more than I should have done, but so I'll leave the floor to Professor Helena Blomberg, who will go on. Thank you for